So within a month of these northern workers going down to the south and registering people in the city of Macomb, more than they had limited success. Six more African Americans had indeed registered to vote. But when you look at the numbers in terms of how many were eligible, it was somewhat depressing that only six had been able to vote. The fact that six registered, though, scared the white officials within the city. And so as a result, these white officials are going to wind up jailing the Northern civil rights leaders who had come down to register people. It's actually going to get so severe that they wind up beating Robert Moses, who was the head of the SNCC at the time, and they chase him until basically there gets to be this huge car crash. The driver lived for a second and then was murdered by this group that was chasing him. And there's no known proof as to who all does all this, but it was pretty sure that it was a member of the state legislature who winds up killing the driver for Robert Moses. Again, it's just people from the north going down, going door to door to the houses of these African American families in this one city, trying to get them to fill out a form. And this was the violence that these civil rights workers were met with. Eventually, it's going to lead to a bunch of protests, obviously. In this case, a bunch of high school students are going to lead a march, and it should say that was soon joined by other SNCC leadership. And again, violence and arrest, the same old back and forth. Ultimately, the voting registration drives are going to come to an end with just 24 new voters registered. The violence was just so severe that the civil rights workers felt they no longer were safe enough to do this. You can see the parades that they're doing, however, for some of these changes. Efforts to register black voters, however, did continue around the nation. They're like, okay, we're going to abandon Macomb, we're going to try elsewhere, and then we're going to come back, later on. And so what's going to happen is another one of these groups is going to be created, this one known as COFO, which stands for the Council of Federated Organizations. And COFO was an effort to coordinate voter registration drives that little groups have been doing all over the place. So it's like, instead of having a bunch of little groups doing the same job, let's have one big committee working together. The size of this committee, however, was enough to scare many of the non-sympathetic whites, which would lead them to, bring violence against COFO, particularly burning their offices, as well as killing and or beating COFO workers. This continued violence frightened many African Americans into refusing to attempt to register. They're like, you know what, it's just not worth it. There's too much violence around us for us to risk our lives to vote. No one's going to listen to our vote anyways. They wanted to vote, but they were just too scared. So what winds up happening is COFO decides to conduct two different mock elections. And the idea was that they kind of had these meeting places that they thought the African American population would feel would be safe, and they called them in and said, okay, this is how you register, this is how you vote, let's just act like this is going to count. I mean, I don't know if Maumee High School has ever done a mock election in other schools in the area, but it's the idea of, okay, these aren't going to actually count as anything, but we're going to go through the whole process just so you can see what the process is and you can see what the outcome is, the difference that one vote really can make. And as a result, it actually is going to inspire a lot more black people to want to vote. 4 times the number of registered black voters turned out in order to participate in just these mock elections, demonstrating just how much they wanted these rights. Around the same time, you have Freedom Summer. In 1964, Freedom Summer is going to start when SNCC is going to recruit volunteers on northern college campuses to head down to Mississippi to help with the registration process in terms of getting people registered to vote. On June 20th, 1964, 3 of these people who, again, they had volunteered and their job was to be a register, disappeared. Their bodies were discovered 6 weeks later, brutally beaten, clearly murdered. And this actually just kind of makes everything come to a head again. It's just another one of these really extreme cases of All these guys were trying to do was to help black people have the rights that the Constitution said they did. And for that, they got brutally murdered. Um, this incident is going to be enough to prompt President Johnson to use the FBI to investigate the killings. The FBI is finally going to step up and say, that's it. We're done with these race violence. We're not going to let this happen anymore. And so while, yes, African Americans were still scared and they were hesitant to register and they were hesitant to vote, the fact that they saw the President of the United States ordering the FBI in was enough to give them just the slightest bit of hope. In addition to registering African American voters, COFO is also going to create what's called the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party. And what they're going to do is it's going to be kind of like a miniature Democratic political party in order to send delegates to the 1964 Democratic National Convention. They wanted to have representation at the DNC in '64. Johnson supported this. He's like, why don't we? Obviously, the state legislature of Mississippi isn't voluntarily going to send black people to go to the national convention. They're obviously, from what we've just learned, not treating African Americans very well at all. And so Johnson really liked this idea because he saw it as a way to get African Americans to have some voice. But the problem was that if he supported it too hard, he knew he would lose a lot of the votes from white people in the South. So he was in this really torn position where he's like, okay, well, I'm going to lose white vote, but I might gain some black vote. But then again, not very many black people are able to vote. So what did I do? So he decides to come up with this compromise where he basically convinces the Democratic Party of Mississippi to send 2 of the state's representatives from the MFDP. So where the MFDP thought they were going to have this huge presence, they wind up having just 2. But that was 2 more than they would have had without Johnson's intervention. And so it's a compromise, marginal at best. It becomes clear that the efforts towards civil rights were stagnant in Mississippi at this time, that they had kind of reached this plateau. So civil rights leaders are like, all right, we were trying in Georgia, got mild success. Try in Alabama, things stalled there. Try in Mississippi, things stalled there. All right, let's go back to Alabama. So, I mean, all they're going to do is focus their attention on these southern states. Why the South? Well, this is the area that was perhaps the most overtly racist, and obviously not all the people of the South, and it's really important that we recognize that. But, because of the traditions of slavery and the civil rights and all this stuff, it was just a regional thing. There were racial issues in the North that we'll talk about soon. But in this case, the voter registration drives are going to be happening in Alabama, and they're going to start with the city of Selma. Of the 15,000 black people in the city who were eligible to vote, only 383 were actually registered. And so what happens is the registration leadership in Selma asks Martin Luther King in order to come down and to use his presence and his support in order to help with the efforts. When the African Americans showed up at the election offices in order to register, they were beaten and arrested. Martin Luther King orders a protest march to leave the city and head towards Montgomery. He's like, you know what? We're going to go on this huge march. He loved himself some marches. Let's just go to Montgomery and make our voice heard. We're so upset that we're not getting this right to vote. The governor of the time was a guy by the name of George Wallace. He issues a very public threat that anyone who participated in this march from Selma to Montgomery were going to be arrested. Right? He's like, I will throw you in jail, and I will not ask questions, and I will not put any protections. You walk along these streets, you're probably going to get beat up, and well, you have it coming, is what Wallace more or less said. But 600 people arrived on March 7th in order to begin this 50-mile march. And along the way, as Wallace promised, these people were beat. They were taunted. They were harassed. Thousands of Americans, however, poured into Montgomery in order to show their support to the marchers. Within 2 weeks, under the protection of federal marshals, because of the order of President Johnson, who had called the marshals in, these marchers who had stalled temporarily are going to restart their journey, and they're going to make it. So it's like they started, got beat, got stalled, LBJ orders federal marshals in, they get going, and they make it. And this inspires Congress to pass the Voter Registration Act of 1965, which put the entire registration process under federal control instead of state control. And this made it illegal for states to use the various techniques that we've talked about to prevent people from registering to vote. Now, if you wanted to register, if you wanted to sign up, you could. And if you were somehow blocked, you could sue. Within 3 years, registration in the South for African Americans jumped from under 10% to nearly 60%. This shows how desperately they had wanted to vote, but how scared they had been. Finally, the civil rights movement was experiencing positive results. This is Martin Luther King, obviously. This is George Wallace, and, you know, somewhat disturbing image. Now, they're getting success, but it's very, very slow. And for some people within the civil rights movement, they started to question the effectiveness of nonviolence. They're like, this is, yeah, we're making some success, but it's taken so long to get such little results. So, within the civil rights movement, a militant faction kind of started to form. Militant just means, you know, wanting to use force or willing to use force if necessary. Of all the various military organizations, and there's a lot of them, there's not just like one or two, there's dozens. The most powerful was the Nation of Islam. And this was founded by Wallace Fard in Detroit, Michigan in 1930, before the civil rights movement had even really begun. But it's going to have this revival during this time period. The organization was based on the Islamic religion, but the Nation of Islam, also known as Black Muslims within the U.S., not just took the teachings of the Prophet Muhammad, but also emphasized the idea that Black people were superior to all other races, and as such had the right, had the birthright to use whatever violence necessary to prove that point, to show that Black people were the best race. So it kind of took some principles of Islam. You know, there were a lot of elements of peace would be preferred, peace would be nice. You know, there's supreme deity and all these types of things that Islam teaches. It wasn't the violent side. The violence was just something that happened. So don't relate the violence with the Islamic side. That's very, very important. For Fard, you know, he just happened to believe in the teachings of the Prophet Muhammad, and he thought the civil rights movement wasn't working, so kind of blended the two. In the early 1930s, the new leadership is going to fall to Elijah Muhammad, and he's going to expand his membership to over 8,000. He's going to urge African Americans to create their own republics within the U.S. and reject the last names that they had as the relics of slavery and use X instead. Many African Americans at the time, when their ancestors had been freed from slavery, had taken the last names that had been given to them as slaves. And he's like, let's get rid of anything that can tie us back to slavery. Let's just go with X, because we don't know what our real last names were. And so X just symbolizes whatever that name was. He also stressed self-discipline. He said, don't drink, don't smoke. He had a very strict diet. He wanted to keep your minds and your bodies pure, and so you were supposed to pray. They reject governmental financial assistance, so don't take any governmental money or handouts. Don't serve in World War II, and so many of them are going to boycott the draft, which is actually going to wind up in a lot of them being jailed, including Muhammad himself. While he's in jail, he's going to realize, hey, you know what? Here's a whole bunch of other people that I can recruit. So he starts recruiting these convicts and lower income Black people. So by the time of the 1960s massive civil rights movement, membership in the Black Islam movement had reached over 100,000 people. And of these, the most famous is probably Malcolm X.